All right, listeners, get ready to dive deep today because we're tackling a real head scratcher. Practical reason. How we figure out what we should do, not just what's true.
It's a deceptively simple question, isn't it? But as soon as you start peeling back the layers, things get complicated quickly.
Oh, tell me about it. Luckily, we've got an expert here to help us navigate this philosophical maze.
Happy to help untangle things as best I can.
We'll be working with excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on practical reason. It's a dense one, but it gets right to the heart of some really fundamental questions.
Definitely a classic philosophical text. One of the first things it clarifies is the distinction between practical and theoretical reason, which is a really good place to start.
Right, like theoretical reason, you're trying to figure out what is like scientific laws, historical facts, that kind of thing. But practical reason, that's all about figuring out what we ought to do, the choices, actions, and the reasons behind them.
Exactly. And the thing is, both of these types of reasoning are normative. They're both concerned with what we ought to believe or do. It's not just about observing facts, it's about making judgments based on reasons.
So even when we're figuring out what's true about the world, there's this element of evaluation. We have to decide which beliefs are justified, which explanations make the most sense.
Precisely. And that's where things start to get tricky because it highlights a crucial difference between practical and theoretical reasoning. Theoretical reasoning aims to modify our beliefs about the world, while practical reason is directed at our intentions and has the potential to lead to action.
That makes sense. But then what happens when our beliefs and intentions clash? Like when we know we should do something but end up doing something else entirely.
The classic philosophical problem of acrasia or weakness of will. It's that frustrating experience of knowing the best course of action but failing to act on it.
Like when you know you should be hitting the gym but end up on the couch with a bag of chips instead. Been there.
We all have. And this phenomenon of acrasia really throws a wrench into simple models of practical reason. If reason alone were enough to motivate us, we wouldn't see this gap between what we believe we ought to do and what we actually do.
Right, which brings up a big question. How do we reconcile this idea of reason with its norms and judgments with a purely naturalistic worldview? If we're just physical beings governed by cause and effect, how can reason have any real authority over our actions?
That's the challenge of naturalism. One popular attempt to ground practical reason in a naturalistic framework is through expressivism. Expressivism tries to interpret normative judgments, like moral judgments, as expressions of our desires and emotions.
So instead of saying stealing is wrong, an expressivist might say something like, boo stealing, or, ugh, I just don't like stealing.
Right. It's all about grounding morality in our subjective experiences rather than in some kind of objective moral truth out there in the universe.
Okay, I see the appeal of that. But does expressivism really hold up? Can it really account for the feeling that we sometimes act against our own judgment? If moral judgments are just expressions of personal preference, why would we ever feel guilty or ashamed for going against them?
You've hit upon one of the main criticisms of expressivism. It does seem to struggle to explain the authority of reason over our desires, especially in cases of acrasia.
So if expressivism isn't quite cutting it, what are some of the other ways philosophers try to square this circle? What are some of the competing contenders in the ring?
While on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have realists. Realists hold on to the belief that there are objective moral truths, just like there are objective truths in science. They believe these truths are out there waiting to be discovered, totally independent of our desires or beliefs.
That's a bold stance for sure. But how do we even access these objective moral truths? If they're out there, what kind of compass are we using to navigate this moral landscape?
That's where realists offer different accounts. Some point to moral intuition as a faculty we have to grasp these truths, others to carefully reasoned arguments that start from basic moral principles, which we can kind of uncover through logic and careful thinking. But realism isn't the only alternative to expressivism. There's also Kantian constructivism.
Ah, yes, the Kantian approach, always intriguing. Give us the rundown.
Kantian constructivism takes a different path altogether. Instead of grounding moral truths in external facts or just subjective desires, it argues that the principles of practical reason are constructed by rational agents themselves.
So it's like we're all mini lawmakers in the realm of reason, creating the very rules that govern our actions.
In a sense, yes. Kant thought that rational agents, just by virtue of their capacity for reason, are committed to certain principles that govern their actions. These principles aren't arbitrary, though. They stem from the very structure of practical reason itself.
Wow, okay, my brain's definitely getting a workout here. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of these different approaches to understanding practical reason.
We've certainly laid some important groundwork, but trust me, there's a lot more to unpack. This relationship between reason and motivation, it's a tangled web, for sure. So, we've been talking about this tangled web of reason and motivation. Well, let's dive right into the heart of it.
Yeah.
What actually makes us get up and act?
Right, it's the age-old question. Does it all come from within our desires, our goals, those kinds of things?
Hmm.
Or can reasons for acting come from outside, almost like some kind of external compass pointing us toward what we should do, even if we don't feel like it?
You hit the nail on the head. That's the debate between internalism and externalism in a nutshell. Internalists, they argue that our reasons for action have to be connected to our pre-existing motivations, the stuff we already care about.
So, like, my reason for going to the store has to be tied to something I already want, like
Yeah.
needing groceries or wanting to pick up a birthday present for a friend. It can't just be some random ought floating out there in the universe, totally disconnected from me.
Exactly. That connection to pre-existing motivations is key for internalists. If a reason doesn't have any grip on what we already care about, how could it possibly get us to move? It'd be like trying to push a car with a feather.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those times when we learn something new that changes our perspective? Can't we develop new motivations, new reasons for acting that weren't part of our original set of desires?
That's the challenge internalism faces, and it's where externalism steps in. Externalists argue that reasons for action can exist independently of our prior desires. They believe that the features of our situation, the objective circumstances, can give us reasons to act, even if those reasons don't align with what we currently want.
So it's like discovering you have a long-lost relative you never knew about. Suddenly that new information, that relationship, creates a reason for you to reach out, even if you didn't have a pre-existing desire to connect with them before.
Precisely. Externalists argue that reason can open up new possibilities for us, show us the value of things we might not have considered before. It's how we grow and learn.
It's almost like reason can broaden our horizons, expand what we care about, what we see as valuable.
That's a great way to put it. It's essential for growth, for developing our moral compass, for being able to respond to the world in all its complexity.
So we've got these two big camps, internalism and externalism. Are there other major perspectives on this relationship between reason and motivation, or are those the main contenders?
Those are definitely the core positions, though of course there are nuances and variations within each camp. A lot of the debate hinges on how we understand intentions and how they connect to things like beliefs, desires.
I'm all ears. Break it down for me. How do intentions fit into this whole puzzle?
Well, internalists tend to emphasize the difference between intentions and beliefs. They'd say beliefs are about representing the world as it is, kind of like taking a snapshot of reality. Intentions, on the other hand, are more like blueprints for action, shaping the world to fit our desires, almost like being an architect of our own lives.
So beliefs are about our minds fitting the world, and intentions are about the world fitting our minds.
You got it. And because of this difference, internalists have a hard time seeing how reason alone, without the fuel of pre-existing motivations, could create brand new intentions. It'd be like trying to build a house without any materials.
But then externalists would probably push back and say, hold on, if we can be rationally persuaded to change our beliefs about the world, why can't we be rationally persuaded to change our intentions for acting in the world?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They might point out that even when we're dealing with theoretical reasoning, which is about beliefs, our dispositions to be responsive to reasons play a role. So why couldn't those same dispositions explain how practical reasoning leads to new intentions? It's a fair point.
Wow, it's a real back and forth, this debate.
Yeah.
So much seems to hinge on the relationship between reason and these more basic mental states, beliefs, desires, intentions, the whole shebang.
It really does. And to complicate things further, some philosophers even suggest that intentions might come from mental capacities that are totally separate from the ones we use for theoretical reasoning. Like, there might be unique psychological mechanisms just for generating intentions, not necessarily tied to pre-existing motivations.
Okay, so there's no easy answer here, it seems. The connection between reason and motivation is about as clear as mud.
It definitely keeps us philosophers busy. And it gets even trickier when we start looking at specific norms of practical reason, like the idea of instrumental rationality.
Instrumental rationality, that's all about choosing the right means to achieve our ends, right? Seems pretty straightforward on the surface, like connecting the dots.
It does, but even this seemingly simple principle has sparked quite a bit of debate in philosophy. You'd be surprised.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What are some of the controversial bits surrounding instrumental rationality? What are the things that make philosophers go, wait a minute, is that really all there is to it?
One of the biggest questions is whether instrumental rationality is the only thing practical reason requires of us. Are there other, even more fundamental norms at play that we need to consider?
I can see how that would be a sticking point. If the only thing reason tells us is to be effective in getting what we want, then it seems like anything goes as long as we're good at achieving our goals. Morality goes out the window.
That's the worry. The instrumental principle all by itself doesn't tell us whether our ends are actually worth pursuing, whether they're rational in a bigger sense. And this is where that famous Humean perspective comes in. Reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions.
So Hume was basically saying reason's only job is to serve our desires, not to judge them or tell us which desires are better than others. It's just there to help us get what we want, no matter what that is.
That's the classic Humean view, leading to a pretty minimalist picture of what practical reason is all about. But a lot of philosophers find this view way too restrictive. They think reason has to play a part in evaluating our ends, not just figuring out the how-to.
Otherwise, we're stuck with a purely subjective view of what counts as a good reason for action. It'd be like saying there's no difference between choosing to eat a healthy salad and choosing to eat a whole tub of ice cream as long as you really wanted it. That's all that matters.
Exactly. And this leads to some fundamental questions about normativity itself. If there are no objective standards for judging the value of our goals, then where does that ought in the instrumental principle even come from? If everything is subjective, how can we say we ought to do anything at all?
That's a great point. The instrumental principle itself is making a normative claim, saying we should be consistent in our actions, that it's irrational to not take the necessary steps to achieve our aims. But if there's no objective good or bad, what's backing up that should?
You've hit on a real philosophical puzzle here. Philosophers who want to defend a stronger view of practical reason, a view that goes beyond just Hume's minimalist take, have to wrestle with this challenge. They need to explain how instrumental rationality can be normative without resorting to some mysterious realm of objective values that exist out there, separate from human desires and beliefs.
It sounds like walking a tightrope, trying to balance those two things.
It is. One way they try to do this is to say that the instrumental principle isn't just about taking the necessary means to whatever ends we happen to have. It also suggests that if those means are unacceptable, maybe because they clash with other things we value, then we've got a reason to rethink the end itself.
So it's not just about blindly chasing after goals. It's about being open to changing those goals based on what it would take to achieve them and whether those means fit with our broader values.
Precisely. This is the idea behind a wide-scope understanding of the instrumental principle. It lets us critique actions that lead to undesirable outcomes, even if those actions make sense from a purely goal-oriented perspective.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also brings up another question. If we're allowed to critique our goals based on their consequences, aren't we sneaking objective values back in through the back door? How can we judge an end as bad or undesirable without appealing to some standard of value that goes beyond just a single person's preferences?
Ah, that's a sharp observation. It highlights the constant tension between the minimalist, Humean view of reason and the desire for a richer, more normatively robust account of how we ought to act.
It's like we're on this seesaw between subjective desires and some sense of what's objectively good or rational. It's hard to find that balance point.
That's a great way to put it. And this balancing act gets even trickier when we consider the idea of maximizing rationality.
Maximizing rationality, that's the idea that we should always aim to choose the action that will lead to the absolute best possible outcome, right? Sounds good in theory, but I can already see how that could get messy in real life.
You're right to be hesitant. The maximizing model is appealing, especially for people who are skeptical about objective values. It seems to give us a way to judge our actions without having to rely on any external standards. The idea is we can critique our choices based on how well they fit with our own preferences, even if we don't believe in some universal hierarchy of values that exists out there.
So it's like a self-contained system of evaluation.
Yeah.
My choices are judged not against some external yardstick of good and bad, but against my own internal set of desires and goals.
Exactly. And the maximizing model, the way it's been developed in decision theory and rational choice theory, tries to formalize this idea with mathematical precision. You get these axioms and principles for calculating the expected utility of different actions, all very neat and tidy on paper.
I'm all for neat and tidy, but I have a feeling real life is rarely that cooperative. We often have to make decisions based on incomplete information, gut feelings, and intuition. Sometimes you just have to go with your gut.
You're absolutely right, and that's where the maximizing model starts to show its limitations. Critics argue that it's too idealistic, too removed from the messy reality of how humans actually make decisions. We often satisfice rather than maximize, choosing options that are good enough rather than obsessively searching for the absolute best. Plus, we're influenced by our past commitments, our sense of self, even if those things don't perfectly align with a purely maximizing approach.
It's like saying, even if I could perfectly calculate the utility of every single choice in front of me, I'm still going to be guided by my values, my sense of what matters, even if those things can't be perfectly quantified or plugged into an algorithm. Life's not always a spreadsheet, right?
Exactly. And this brings in all sorts of interesting questions about the role of emotions, intuition, and what some philosophers call the heuristic dimension of practical reason. It's not always about cold, hard calculation. Sometimes it's about understanding ourselves, getting clear about our values, and figuring out how to navigate the complexity of life with a blend of reason and lived experience.
It feels like we're moving beyond just numbers and equations and into the realm of values, meaning self-understanding, the stuff that actually makes us human.
That's a great observation. And this brings us to another really important part of practical reason: how we reason about value itself.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. What makes something good or bad, right or wrong? Is it all subjective, just a matter of personal taste? Or are there some objective standards of value out there, some kind of universal measuring stick?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question, and it's at the heart of so many philosophical debates. One key issue is whether value is grounded in states of affairs, meaning the outcomes of our actions, or if it's more fundamentally about the actions themselves, about how we choose to act in the world. It's a subtle but really important distinction.
So it's like the classic consequentialism versus deontology debate, right?
Yeah.
Consequentialists say the morality of an action is determined by its results, the good or bad it produces. Geontologists believe some actions are just inherently right or wrong, regardless of their consequences.
You've got it. And this debate plays out in really interesting ways within practical reason. Some philosophers think the instrumental principle, because of its focus on means and ends, leans toward a consequentialist view of value. It's all about achieving those desired outcomes, about maximizing the good, however you define that.
But doesn't that leave out a huge part of our moral experience? I mean, what about our duties to others, our sense of justice, our commitments to things like honesty and fairness? Those don't seem easily reduced to just maximizing good outcomes.
You're raising some excellent points, and that's where alternative ways of thinking about value come in. Some philosophers argue that we shouldn't just focus on the consequences of actions, on those states of affairs. We need to pay attention to the intrinsic value of the actions themselves, the way they reflect certain virtues or express our core commitments. It's not just about what we achieve, but how we achieve it.
So it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey, right? It's about the kind of people we become in the process of acting.
Exactly. This expressive view of value suggests that actions can be rational, not just because they lead to good outcomes, but because they express the right kind of attitude, the right relationship to the things we value. It's about integrity, about aligning our actions with who we want to be.
Like, even if I could achieve some great good by lying, the act of lying itself would betray my values. It would be a violation of the kind of person I want to be.
Precisely. This leads to a richer, more nuanced understanding of practical reason. It's not just about calculating utilities or maximizing outcomes. It's about aligning our actions with our values, about expressing who we are in the way we choose to live. It's about character.
This discussion of value has really broadened my understanding of what practical reason is all about. It's not just cold logic. It's tied up with our sense of self, our relationships, our place in the world. It's about meaning.
You've hit the nail on the head. And this brings us to one of the most challenging and important applications of practical reason: morality.
Ah, yes, morality, the ultimate testing ground for practical reason. How do we decide what's right and wrong, especially when it involves conflicting values, personal sacrifices, the well-being of others? It gets complicated fast.
Those are questions that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. They take us into some of the most fascinating and complex territory in all of practical reason.
Well, I think this is a good place to pause and let our listeners digest everything we've covered so far. We've gone from the basic nature of reasons to the challenges of instrumental rationality, maximizing models, this complex interplay between prudence and morality. It's a lot to take in.
It's been quite a journey. We've just begun to explore the intricacies of moral reasoning, which is where things get really interesting.
So be sure to join us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll tackle those moral dilemmas head on. We'll be exploring the conflict between prudence and morality, the challenge of justifying moral norms in a world where everything seems to come down to self-interest, and a lot more. You won't want to miss it. Welcome back for the final leg of our journey into practical reason. So far, we've explored the nature of reason, its complex dance with motivation, and different ways of thinking about value. But now we're entering the arena where things get really real, the domain of morality.
It's where practical reason faces its toughest challenges. Morality forces us to confront those big questions of obligation, sacrifice, and the very foundations of our ethical beliefs. It really puts our reasoning to the test.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest questions that comes up is whether moral norms, those shoulds and should nots, actually have any real authority over us. Why should we be moral, especially when it clashes with our own self-interest? It's a question that's probably crossed all of our minds at some point.
It's a fundamental question, no doubt. Skeptics would say that ultimately we're all driven by self-interest, by this desire for our own well-being. They see moral rules as more like social conventions, maybe even strategies for getting along, but not something that has any real power to bind us or compel us to act against our own good. It's a bit of a dog-eat-dog world in that view.
It's kind of a bleak outlook, right? To think that morality is just a facade we put up for convenience rather than something we truly believe in and strive for. It makes you wonder if those good deeds are really all that good.
It can definitely feel that way. And the skeptical view gains some traction from the apparent conflict between morality and prudence. Morality, at least how we usually think about it, calls for impartiality, considering everyone's well-being equally. But prudence, on the other hand, seems to say that we should prioritize our own interests, that we should look out for number one. It's a tug of war.
Right. It's that classic dilemma.
Right.
The call of self-interest versus the call of duty. How do different philosophical approaches try to reconcile those two seemingly opposing forces? How do we make sense of that tension?
Well, one response is to just embrace the conflict, to say that's just the nature of things. This is the dualism of practical reason position. Henry Sidgwick, a philosopher, argued that both prudence and morality are legitimate sources of reasons for action, but they often pull us in opposite directions, leaving us in this constant state of internal struggle. We're always trying to balance those competing demands.
It's like having two compasses, each pointing to a different north. No wonder moral decision-making can feel so confusing and difficult sometimes. It's like, which way do I go?
Exactly. It's not an easy situation to be in. Now, some philosophers try to resolve this dualism by saying that morality can ultimately be justified on prudential grounds. They'd say that acting morally, even when it involves some sacrifice, is actually in our best interest in the long run because it leads to a more stable, more harmonious society, which benefits everyone, including ourselves. So doing the right thing is actually the smart thing to do.
It's a clever approach, right?
Yeah.
It appeals to our self-interest to justify moral behavior. But I wonder, does it really hold up in the end? Isn't there always that temptation to cheat the system to get the benefits of a moral society without actually contributing to it, without pulling your own weight?
Yeah, that's a big challenge for this kind of argument. It leads some philosophers to say, no, we can't just reduce morality to self-interest. They argue that moral reasons have their own kind of authority, a distinct kind of pull, obligating us in a way that goes beyond just calculating personal gain or loss. It's not just about what's in it for me.
So it's not just a matter of what's good for me. It's about recognizing that there are certain principles, certain duties that bind us regardless of our personal preferences or what the consequences might be for our own well-being.
Yeah,
It's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, period.
exactly. One way to understand this distinct authority of moral reasons is to focus on their agent-relative nature. This means that moral obligations often have a special kind of weight, a special meaning for the individual who's taken them on. It goes beyond their contribution to some kind of general good. It's personal.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by agent relative? I'm not sure I'm following.
Sure. Think about the act of making a promise. When you promise someone you'll do something, it creates a special obligation for you specifically. It's not just about promoting promise-keeping as some kind of general principle. Even if breaking that promise could somehow lead to more promises being kept overall, it wouldn't erase your obligation to keep the specific promise you made. You're accountable for your own actions, even if the bigger picture looks different.
It's like when you owe someone money. It's your debt, your responsibility to pay it back, even if someone else could swoop in and make a larger donation to the cause of debt relief. Your obligation is personal.
It's a good way to think about it. These agent-relative reasons often come in the form of constraints or prohibitions. They're not just about giving us reasons to do things, they're about setting limits on what we're allowed to do, even if we're pursuing worthwhile goals. They draw a line in the sand.
So even if lying could sometimes lead to a positive outcome, the act of lying itself is off limits because it violates this fundamental moral principle. The ends don't justify the means, so to speak.
Exactly. And these moral constraints, these deontic requirements, are a real challenge for theories of practical reason. They don't fit neatly into the instrumental model, with its emphasis on maximizing good outcomes. They seem to be operating on a different level, and fundamental principles that guide and limit our actions, regardless of the potential consequences. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard.
It's like there are these inviolable rules built into the very fabric of practical reason. Rules that say, nope, some actions are simply off limits, no matter how tempting they might be, or how much good they could potentially achieve. It's about sticking to those principles.
That's a powerful way to put it. There are lots of different philosophical approaches to explaining these moral constraints. Kantians, for example, would say these constraints are self-imposed by rational agents, stemming from the very structure of practical reason itself. Virtue ethicists would say that these constraints are part of what it means to be a good person, reflecting the virtues and character traits that allow us to live well and thrive in a community. Different perspectives, but all pointing to this idea that morality matters.
It sounds like there isn't just one right answer, like the nature and justification of morality is this big open-ended philosophical question, a puzzle with lots of different pieces.
It definitely is. But even with all their differences, these various approaches all agree on one key point. Moral reasoning has its own unique structure and authority. We can't just boil it down to instrumental calculations or appeals to self-interest. Morality has its own logic, its own set of principles.
It's like saying morality has its own internal compass, its own way of guiding us that goes beyond just personal gain or maximizing some abstract good. It's about something deeper.
That's a great way to put it. And this recognition of the special nature of moral reasoning really changes how we understand practical reason as a whole. It tells us that reason isn't just about being efficient or achieving our goals. It's also about recognizing and responding to the demands of morality, to those principles that guide us towards right action, even when it's tough or requires sacrifice. It's about aligning our lives with what we believe is good and just.
Well, listeners, it looks like we've reached the summit of our deep dive into practical reason. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nature of reasons themselves to the challenges of instrumental rationality, those maximizing models, and this really intricate dance between prudence and morality. It's been quite a journey.
It has. A stimulating exploration of a truly fundamental part of human thought. Hopefully, our discussion has shed some light on the complexity and richness of practical reason, how we figure out what we ought to do. It's a topic that's relevant to all of us.
I know I've learned a lot from this conversation. Before we sign off, I'd like to leave you with one final, thought-provoking question. If reason isn't just about maximizing our own personal benefit, but also about understanding and responding to values, including those sometimes messy and demanding moral values, what does that mean for how we live our lives? It's something to ponder as we move forward.
That's a fantastic question, and one that each of us has to grapple with as we navigate our own paths. There's no easy answer, but it's a question worth asking.
Well said. A huge thanks to our expert for guiding us through this philosophical labyrinth, for helping us untangle some of the knots. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to more resources if you want to keep exploring these fascinating ideas on your own. Until next time, keep those minds engaged and remember the journey of practical reason is ongoing.